We would love to know. 24 years old, and Eliza Vane was already counted among the dead. The men who called themselves outriders for the Cobb family left her broken and bleeding at the bottom of a nameless canyon in the Arizona territory, certain the desert would finish what their guns had started. They took the strongbox meant to carry her late uncle's inheritance. They took the horses, and they took every soul in that stagecoach party but her. What they left behind was $7 sewn into her petticoat hem, a silver locket that had belonged to her mother, and a woman too stubborn to die quietly. When she finally dragged herself out of that canyon 3 days later, half mad with thirst, she used the last of her $7 to buy the one thing nobody else in the county would touch: a collapsing line shack at the canyon's mouth, a place folks called cursed, a place tied to an outlaw gang that had vanished a generation before. She bought it because it was cheap, because it was hers, and because she had nowhere else in the world to go. She did not know yet that beneath its floorboards lay a secret that had waited 20 years to be found. A secret that would not only save her, but would return to an entire town everything it believed it had lost forever. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Eliza Vane. Eliza had been raised in the town of Cinder Ridge, a hard little settlement pressed against the red rock of the territory, where her father, Thomas Vane, kept the only forge for 30 miles. From the time she could hold a hammer, Eliza had stood at his elbow, learning the patient language of iron, how it screamed when it was wrong and sang when it was right, how a lock's teeth told a story if you knew how to listen to them, how patience with metal was really just patience with truth. Thomas was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one, and he raised his daughter with 2 convictions that would follow her the rest of her days: that a thing's worth was never decided by what it looked like on the outside, and that a debt owed to the dead was still a debt. He used to tell her that the forge did not care whether the metal arriving on his bench was rusted scrap or polished silver. What mattered was what it could become. Eliza absorbed this the way children absorb the things said most often by the people they love most, without knowing yet how much she would need it. Her mother, Ruth, had died of a fever when Eliza was 11, leaving behind the silver locket and a Bible with names written inside its cover going back 3 generations. Thomas never remarried. He raised Eliza between the forge and the kitchen, teaching her to read ledgers as easily as she read scripture, teaching her the particular cipher system he used to mark which customers still owed him money, a habit, he said, from his own father, who had once kept books for a freight company and distrusted plain writing left where any thief could read it. It was a small, strange skill, the kind that seems useless until the one day it isn't. Eliza grew into a young woman known around Cinder Ridge for her steadiness rather than her softness. She did not flinch at blood. She did not flinch at hard news. And she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who has never once been given anything she didn't earn. When Eliza was 22, her father died in a rockslide while hauling ore for a mining contract he'd taken to cover a lean winter. In his final months, he had spoken often of his brother, Eliza's Uncle Michael, a man who had gone east years before and made a modest fortune in the shipping trade, and who had written faithfully every Christmas asking after his niece. When word reached Michael of his brother's death, he wrote back with an offer that felt, to a grieving young woman with nothing left in Cinder Ridge but memory, like a rope thrown down a well. "Come east," he said, "and bring what little the forge is worth when you sell it, and I will see you settled properly, with an inheritance from your grandfather's estate besides." It was not vanity that made Eliza agree. It was exhaustion and grief and the simple human hope that somewhere, some family might still be waiting for her. She sold the forge for far less than it was worth, packed what she owned into a single trunk, and boarded the stagecoach line running north out of Cinder Ridge toward the railhead at Prescott. Carrying in a locked strongbox both her uncle's promised inheritance, wired ahead and collected at the way station, and the small collection of coin that was, quite literally, everything she had left in the world. The driver was a weathered man named Obadiah Trask, who had run that line for 15 years without incident, which was precisely why no one thought twice when he mentioned, almost in passing, that a new outrider had joined the route escort that season. A broad, quiet man who called himself Silas Cobb. The attack came at dusk, in the narrows where the road dropped into the canyon country, exactly where a driver with 15 years of experience would know the coach could not turn or run. Eliza would remember very little of it clearly afterward. The scream of the lead horse, the crack of gunfire, Obadiah Trask falling from the box without a sound, the strong box torn from beneath her feet, and then hands on her, rough and businesslike, dragging her from the wreckage toward the canyon's lip. She remembered the voice of the man in charge, low and almost bored, telling his men not to waste a bullet on her, that the fall and the sun would do the work for free. She remembered falling. She did not remember landing. What she woke to, hours or a day later, was a broken wrist, a gash along her scalp crusted with blood and canyon dust, and a silence so complete it felt like the world had ended, and simply neglected to inform her. For 3 days she survived on nothing but the will her father had built into her, one lesson at a time. Patience with hard things, faith that what looked ruined might not be finished. She followed a dry wash on instinct until it widened, until she found a trickle of spring water pooling beneath a stand of cottonwoods. And there, half delirious, she was found by an old trapper woman named Nell Ferris, who took one look at her and said only, "Well, you're too stubborn to be a ghost," before hauling her onto a mule and taking her home. Nell nursed Eliza back through the worst of the fever that followed, feeding her broth, and the blunt, unsentimental company of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlived every soul who'd ever doubted her. It was Nell who told her, once she was strong enough to hear it, that everyone in Cinder Ridge and the surrounding county believed the whole Stagecoach party dead, robbed by Silas Cobb's outriders, and that the loss had struck the region hard. Obadiah Trask had been well loved, and the strongbox taken that day had carried, besides Eliza's own modest fortune, funds the town of Larkspur Wells, some 10 miles on, had been counting on to rebuild its schoolhouse after a fire the winter before. Eliza absorbed this news the way she absorbed most hard things now, without visible collapse, filing it away the way her father had taught her to file away a debt not yet settled. She had, by then, exactly $7 to her name, money sewn into her petticoat hem out of an old habit her father had drilled into her. Never carry all your money in one place, and no family left to write to, no home left to return to, and a body still healing from injuries that made hard labor impossible. It was Nell who mentioned, almost as an aside, that the old line shack at the mouth of Widow's Canyon, not 2 miles from where Eliza had been found, was standing empty and unclaimed, and that the county would sell the deed for almost nothing to be rid of it, because no one in 3 counties would live there. The shack, Nell explained, had belonged 20 years before to a man named Jeremiah Hollis, the leader of an outlaw gang that had terrorized freight lines and mining payrolls across the territory in the years just after the war, before vanishing entirely, gang, gold, and Hollis himself, in a single season, as if the canyon had simply swallowed them whole. Some said Hollis had been killed by his own men over a dispute about the loot. Some said he'd fled to Mexico with every dollar the gang had ever taken. Whatever the truth, no one had lived in that shack since, and the superstitious called the canyon cursed, and the practical simply called it worthless. Eliza, lying in Nell's cabin with a mending wrist and nowhere else on earth to be, thought only that $7 for a roof, however cursed, was still a roof, and that she had learned from her father that worthless was a word people used for things they hadn't looked at closely enough. She rode out to the county recorder's office in Larkspur Wells the following week, her arm still bound in a sling, and paid her $7 for the deed to a structure most men wouldn't have paid 7 cents for. The clerk actually laughed, not unkindly, and told her she'd bought herself a haunted henhouse. Eliza only thanked him and asked directions back to the canyon. The shack, when she reached it, was worse than she'd imagined and somehow also more solid. A squat structure of stacked stone and heavy timber, built low against the canyon wall the way a man builds when he means to defend a place rather than simply live in it. 2 decades of wind had scoured the door half off its hinges. Pack rats had claimed the loft, and the single room inside smelled of dust and old smoke. But the walls were sound, the roof mostly whole, and the well out back still ran clear and sweet. Eliza spent her first day simply clearing it, sweeping, mending the door, hauling out rotten furnishings, grateful, in the numb way of the recently grieved, to have work for her hands that asked nothing more of her than effort. It was on the 4th day, while prying up a section of warped floorboard near the old stone hearth to lay new planking, that her crowbar caught on something that wasn't wood at all. Beneath the boards lay a shallow stone-lined cavity, clearly built deliberately, the kind of hiding place a careful man constructs and a hasty one never finds. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, She found a small iron strongbox, no larger than a bread box, its lock crusted with rust, but its hinges, when she worked them, still stubbornly whole. There was no key, but Eliza Vane had spent her whole childhood at her father's elbow, learning to read the language of locks, and this one, old as it was no stranger to her than any lock her father had ever set before her as a lesson. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a bent nail and a sliver of wire, but the lock finally gave with a small, tired click that felt in that silent canyon, almost like a held breath finally released. Inside the strongbox lay not gold, as she had half feared and half hoped, but paper, a leather ledger book, its pages filled with the same careful, cramped handwriting throughout, and beneath it, folded separately, a single sealed letter addressed in that same hand, to whoever finds this. Eliza sat on the floor of that cabin for a long while, before she worked up the courage to open either one. The ledger, once she began to make sense of it, was unmistakably a record of the Hollis gang's operations, dates, amounts, the names of freight lines and mining payrolls robbed across 4 years, tallied with the same dry precision her own father had used to track debts at his forge. But it was not, she came to realize as she read further into the night by lamplight, a boastful accounting. It was a confession, and more than that, a plan. The final third of the ledger listed, item by item, exactly which stolen sums belonged to which victims, the Larkspur Wells Schoolhouse Fund among them. She noted with a chill, alongside notations in the same hand reading returned or intended for return, dated across a span of months in a year 20-some years past. The sealed letter, when she finally broke its wax, explained why. It was written by a man who signed himself only as D, a former member of the Hollis gang who had, by his own account, grown sick with guilt over what the gang had taken from working families in small towns who could not afford the loss. He had begun secretly setting aside a portion of every haul, intending to return it once he judged it safe, keeping this ledger and this cash hidden even from his own gang. But he had never gotten the chance. The letter described in spare and haunted language how Jeremiah Hollis had learned of his intentions, and how Hollis's own most trusted lieutenant, a young, ambitious writer named Cobb, had used that knowledge to turn on both Dee and Hollis in a single violent night, killing Hollis, driving off the rest of the gang, and vanishing with the greater share of the stolen fortune, leaving Dee for dead and this hidden cash undiscovered. Dee had survived, badly wounded, just long enough to bury this box beneath the floor of the shack he and Hollis had once used as a hideout, and to write this letter, before the account ended there unfinished, the last lines trailing into an unsteady scrawl that told her plainly enough how his story had ended. Eliza sat with that letter a long time, the lamp burning low before the second chill of that night arrived. The name Cobb was not a common one in that country, and the outrider who had led the attack on her own stagecoach, 20 years after Dee's letter was written, bore that same name. She would learn in the weeks that followed, through careful questions put to Nell Ferris and to the recorder in Larkspur Wells, that Silas Cobb, currently terrorizing the region's freight routes, was the son of that same young lieutenant, raised on his father's fortune and his father's contempt for the very idea of a debt owed. The wound that had been dealt to this canyon a generation ago had, it seemed, simply never stopped bleeding. It had only changed hands, father to son, theft answering theft, until a woman with nothing left to lose pried up a floorboard and found the whole buried history waiting. The ledger told her something else, too, something that made her hands unsteady as she worked through its final pages by lamplight. Dee had not merely intended to return the money. He had, in the months before his death, actually begun cashing it. Small strong boxes, he wrote, hidden at 3 points along the old freight road, each marked in his ledger by a simple sketched symbol, a private code not unlike the one her own father had used to mark debts in his forge books. 2 of the 3 symbols matched landmarks Eliza did not yet recognize. The third, she realized with a slow, prickling certainty, was drawn to resemble the very hearth beside which she now sat. It took her 2 more days of careful, aching work, her wrist still not fully healed, to widen the cavity beneath the hearthstones themselves, and there she found the second cache. Not gold coin, as legend might have promised, but something nearly as valuable in that dry country and that lean decade, a strong box of silver certificates and mining scrip, the recorded equivalent by Dee's own ledger, of nearly the full sum once meant for the Larkspur Wells schoolhouse, untouched for 20 years waiting. She did not, even then, think of it as hers. Her father's voice was too clear in her memory for that. A debt owed to the dead was still a debt, and this money, however desperately she needed it, had names written beside it in a dead man's careful hand. But she also understood, turning those brittle certificates over in the lamplight, that she alone now held the only proof in existence of what had truly happened in that canyon 20 years ago, and the only means by which an old wrong might finally be set right. She understood, too, that the moment word of this discovery reached the wrong ears, she would become once again exactly what she had been on that stagecoach, a woman standing between Cobb blood and money. Cobb blood believed belonged to it. Word travels strangely in canyon country, less by newspaper than by the accumulated weight of 100 small conversations, and it was not many weeks before rumors reached Larkspur Wells that the widow woman living alone in the old Hollis shack had been seen riding into town with an old ledger book and asking careful questions of the county recorder about land claims and unpaid debts 20 years cold. Eliza had gone about it as quietly as she knew how, meeting first with the town's aging schoolmaster, a gentle, threadbare man named Horace Pruitt, who had never stopped hoping the schoolhouse fund might someday be recovered, and showing him, cautiously, and only after he'd sworn his discretion, enough of the ledger to prove her claim was no madwoman's fantasy. But quiet does not survive long in a small county, and it was only a matter of time before the rumor reached Silas Cobb himself, drinking at the saloon in the rail town 20 miles east where he was known to conduct what business he still called ranching. Cobb rode into Larkspur Wells within the week, and from there out to Widow's Canyon, arriving at Eliza's door with 3 of his men and an expression of studied, dangerous patience. He did not threaten her outright. Men like Cobb rarely needed to, having learned from childhood how much could be accomplished with a smile and a suggestion, but he made plain, in a voice pitched low and almost friendly, that whatever she believed she'd found on that property belonged, by rights of blood and long-standing arrangement, to his family, and that a woman alone in a cursed canyon shack would do well to remember how easily accidents happened. Out in that country, Eliza had learned something in that canyon that Silas Cobb had never had reason to learn, in his own comfortable, unearned prosperity, that fear loses much of its power over a person who has already survived being left for dead. She told him with a steadiness that surprised even her, that she had no intention of keeping a single dollar that belonged to Larkspur Wells, or any other soul robbed by his father and Jeremiah Hollis, and that the ledger she held recorded in detail exactly how his father had murdered his way into the fortune Silas now called his birthright. She did not show him the letter. She did not tell him where the ledger was kept. She only watched something harden behind his eyes, and understood that she had, in speaking plainly, made herself considerably more dangerous to him alive than dead. The weeks that followed tested every ounce of patience her father had built into her. Cobb's men came twice more to the canyon under cover of night, tearing through the shack while she was away tending Nell, searching for the ledger and finding nothing, for Eliza had long since moved both ledger and letter to a locked box at the Larkspur Wells assay office, in the care of a clerk she'd come to trust. The town itself remained divided. Some, hearing only rumors of Hollis gold and canyon curses, treated Eliza with the wary suspicion reserved for outsiders who stir up old, dangerous history. Others, led quietly by Horace Pruitt and by Nell Ferris's considerable, unsentimental reputation, began to wonder aloud whether the woman living alone in that shack might be owed more gratitude than gossip. It was Nell, in the end, who helped Eliza see the shape of what needed to happen next. The territorial marshal's circuit brought a deputy marshal named Aaron Rourke through Larkspur Wells twice a year, a man known for a stubborn insistence on paperwork over reputation, and Nell insisted that a ledger, a letter, and a clear line of stolen inheritance were exactly the kind of evidence such a man could not ignore, whatever protection Cobb's family money had bought him with lazier lawmen in years past. Eliza spent 3 anxious weeks preparing, cross-referencing every entry in Dee's ledger against county freight records Horace Pruitt helped her locate, building a case as painstaking and patient as any lock she had ever picked, so that when Deputy Marshal Rourke finally arrived, she was ready to hand him not rumor, but proof. The confrontation, when it came, unfolded not in violence but in the flat, unglamorous light of the Larkspur Wells land office, where Rourke had summoned both Eliza and Silas Cobb to answer questions about the stagecoach attack that had officially still never been solved. Cobb arrived expecting to intimidate a frightened woman in front of a lawman he assumed would defer to his family's standing. He found instead a room where Horace Pruitt sat with the recovered schoolhouse fund's original paperwork, where the assay clerk had brought the locked ledger and letter at Eliza's prior arrangement, and where Eliza herself laid out, item by careful item, the unbroken chain from Jeremiah Hollis's death, through Dee's murder, through the son who had built his whole fortune and his whole bearing on a crime his own father's ledger had documented in his own hand. Cobb's fury, when it finally broke through his composure, was its own confession, a furious, cornered demand that the ledger be destroyed, and admission in his rage of details about the stagecoach attack that no innocent man would have known. Deputy Marshal Rourke, who had built his career on precisely this kind of patient paperwork, needed very little more than that. Silas Cobb was taken into custody that same afternoon to answer for the attack on Eliza's stagecoach and, in time, for a fuller reckoning with a fortune, increasingly understood by the whole territory to have been built on his father's inherited crime. What Eliza did with the recovered fortune in the months that followed became, in its own quiet way, the true center of her story. She kept nothing beyond a modest sum to see the shack properly repaired and to settle Nell Ferris's long-standing debts at the Mercantile as thanks for a life saved. The rest she returned, dollar for documented dollar. According to Dee's own careful ledger, the Larkspur Wells Schoolhouse Fund restored in full. Smaller sums returned to freight companies and mining families, whose losses Dee had recorded 20 years before. The whole slow unwinding of an old theft handled with the same patient exactness her father had once brought to his forge books. The schoolhouse that rose the following spring, built with lumber and labor donated freely by a town that had come, by then, to understand exactly what Eliza Vane had done for them, was given, over her own quiet objection, the name Vane Hall. She did not sell the shack in Widow's Canyon. She rebuilt it instead, replacing its rotten timbers, repairing its door, planting a small garden where pack rats had once nested, until it stood not as a cursed relic of an outlaw's greed but as proof, plain and standing, of her father's oldest lesson, that a thing's worth is never decided by what it looks like from the outside, and that a debt owed to the dead, however long it waits, can still be paid. And so we return, as we always do, to where this story began, to a young woman left for dead in a nameless canyon, with $7 and a mother's locket and nothing else in the world, buying the one thing no one else would touch. Eliza Vane did not know, standing in that ruined doorway with her wrist still bound and her heart still raw with grief, that she was standing on top of the very wound the whole region had been quietly bleeding from for 20 years. She only knew that she needed a roof and that $7 was $7. It was patience, not luck, that let her find what waited beneath those floorboards. The same patience her father had hammered into her at his forge, one lesson at a time. The same patience that let her survive a canyon meant to be her grave. What she found there did not just restore her own life. It restored a schoolhouse, a town's faith in itself, and a debt 20 years overdue, carried faithfully by a dead man's ledger until the one person patient enough to read it finally came along. Thank you for spending this time with Eliza's story, and with us. If something in her patience or her stubbornness or her refusal to let an old wrong stay buried spoke to you, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. We'll leave you with one question to sit with. What is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Until next time, stay close.